Italo is 35 years old and saw his life completely change when Jorge, his father, suffered an accident that left him in a coma. Since then, Italo has been questioning whether he is a good person or not due to the thoughts that plague his mind, preventing him from sleeping most nights. Jorge was 24 years old when he married Fernanda, his great love since childhood. They met at the age of 6 while playing together on the street where they lived. Their families were neighbors, and a friendship bond quickly formed, extending to their children. Jorge and Fernanda discovered nearly everything in life together, including love. So, at the age of 24, Jorge achieved financial stability by opening a store selling agricultural supplies and married his beloved. The couple was very happy for 2 years, and just when they seemed to be at their happiest, Fernanda discovered she was pregnant with their first child. Fernanda's pregnancy was smooth, but complications arose on the day of delivery, and she passed away. The baby, who would be named Italo, cried loudly as his mother took her last breaths. Jorge was in the delivery room with his wife and went into shock when the doctor informed him that Fernanda would not wake up again. As he heard the fateful words, Jorge stared fixedly at Italo. Although he knew rationally that the child was not to blame for what had happened, it was difficult not to associate his cries announcing life with the beloved wife's final breath. From that moment on, Jorge knew he would hate his son as much as he had loved his deceased wife. After the tragedy, Hilda, Fernanda's younger sister, moved into Jorge's house. She took responsibility for Italo's care during the first months, as it was clear that the father was not capable. However, the longer it went on, the more convinced Hilda became that her brother-in-law would never be able to raise that child. Out of love for her sister and also feeling something she couldn't explain for Jorge, Hilda decided to stay permanently in that house, a choice she would regret for the rest of her life. As Italo grew up, he began to realize that something was wrong with his father. Jorge never complimented him and avoided being alone with him at all costs. Italo inherited his mother's strong character, and as he began to understand better what was happening around him, at the age of 7, he started questioning his father about the treatment he received. Jorge's behavior worsened, he became verbally aggressive towards his son. There was a certain satisfaction in Jorge when he told Italo how much he couldn't stand his presence. Once, Jorge came home from work and sat down at the dinner table, where Hilda and his son were already seated. Italo, happy to see his father, smiled and told him he had scored a perfect 10 on his math exam. He was the only one in his class to achieve this. Jorge's response was that he was just doing his duty. After all, if he received food and clean clothes in that house, the least he could do was excel academically. That particular day hadn't been great for Jorge due to some issues at work, which intensified his ill will towards Italo. Pouring out all his hatred and frustration, Jorge told his son that someone who comes into the world by killing his own mother already has an unpayable debt, so being studious was merely an obligation. That was the first time Italo truly understood why his father hated him. Up until then, at 7 years old, Italo knew his mother had passed away but had no idea how it had happened. Upon hearing his father's words and realizing that his birth was the reason for his mother's premature departure, he knew he would never be loved by Jorge. Before that revelation, the child believed his father was a sad man for having lost his wife but could potentially find happiness again and love his son. The impact of those words made Italo jump up from the table. He was about to run to his room to cry when he heard Jorge tell him he wasn't going anywhere. Life was very tough, and it was better to get used to hearing what he didn't want to hear and to endure it. Jorge also shouted at his son to swallow those tears because, besides taking his mother's life, he would be a weak man. Hilda witnessed the entire scene without reacting. Hilda finally decided to interfere and asked Jorge not to speak to his own son like that. Very irritated with the whole situation, Jorge looked disdainfully at his sister-in-law and told her she was nothing more than an outsider living off his charity. If she didn't like how things were run in the house, she could just leave through the door she came in. Hilda was accustomed to her brother-in-law's unkind manner of treating people, but hearing that hurt her in an unexpectedly deep way. A tear rolled down Hilda's face. Italo, sensing how much his aunt was suffering, held her hand under the table. The two had a strong connection, and Hilda chose to stay by her nephew's side. The truth was that Hilda had loved Jorge since childhood, but she had never been able to approach him the way she wanted because of Fernanda. 3 years younger than her sister and brother-in-law, she was always seen as the girl they took everywhere they went. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, Hilda watched Fernanda live what was secretly her dream. Although she loved Jorge deeply, Hilda never made any attempt in that direction out of respect and love for her sister. When Fernanda passed away in childbirth, Hilda felt that perhaps fate was giving her a chance. Her first thought upon receiving the news left her feeling immensely guilty. Because of that guilt, she accepted all of Jorge's rudeness and decided to take on the role of Italo's mother. The scene that occurred at that dinner would repeat countless times throughout Italo's childhood and adolescence. The older the boy grew, the more rebellious he became, constantly being suspended. No matter how badly Italo behaved, Jorge's reaction was always the same, words of intense disdain and hatred. Deep down, the son wished his father would act like the parents of his classmates, who might get nervous but would try to understand why he was so rebellious. At the age of 15, Italo understood that Jorge would never be like other fathers, and it was a waste of time for him to continue his rebellion. Intelligent, he decided to focus on his studies so that someday he could simply leave that house and start his own life. Jorge noticed the change in behavior, but whenever possible, he made sure to tell his son that no matter what he did, he would never stop being the angel of death to his own mother. Hearing such comments from his own father deeply wounded Italo, but it also fueled him to seek new paths forward. At the age of 16, Italo earned a scholarship and was very excited about the possibility of leaving that house and his father forever. However, being underage, he needed Jorge's permission to move to the boarding school campus where he had been granted the scholarship. The young man believed it would be simple, given Jorge's hatred for him. However, to his great surprise, his father not only refused to sign but also told Italo that he would only leave that house when he died. It was Hilda who comforted her nephew after this refusal. She told him that he would soon be of legal age and could go wherever he wanted. It was this hope that fueled Italo's dreams, pretending not to hear every night during dinner his father telling him how despicable he was for taking his own mother's life at birth. On his 18th birthday, Italo received no congratulations or gifts from his father, only the statement that if he chose to leave, he would have to take Hilda with him. Confused, aunt and nephew asked what that meant, and Jorge replied that it was exactly what they had heard. If Italo decided to leave that house, he must take his aunt along because if she was there as his nanny, she would have no further purpose once the young man left. Hilda felt her legs weaken from the shock of what she had just heard. The man she had loved since childhood was using her to hurt his own son. Having never worked and not having completed the business degree she was pursuing when Fernanda passed away, Hilda had no money and nowhere to go. Fernanda and Hilda's parents had died in an airplane crash 5 years after their eldest daughter. The only blood relative Hilda had in the world was her nephew Italo, for whom she had been like a mother. The boy, despite having such a cruel father, had a good heart and would never abandon her to her fate. Italo received that provocation in defiant silence. Clearly, he had a plan in mind to get himself and his aunt out of that situation. Jorge knew his son would not settle for being trapped in that situation forever. Italo got a job and intended to save money to leave with his aunt. However, on his first day of work, Jorge told him that from now on, Italo and his aunt would need to pay for their stay in the house. The amount charged by him was half of his son's salary. So, despite his efforts to progress, Italo remained with a heavy burden holding him back. Over the years, Italo sought ways to study and obtain better jobs, but his father always found a way to thwart his son's plans. Hilda began to feel like a burden in her nephew's life, and all the distress she felt turned into health problems. Jorge refused to cover her healthcare expenses, leaving Italo to handle them. He realized he could never leave his father's house. However, it was incomprehensible to him why Jorge acted this way. If he hated him so much, why didn't he just let him leave? Italo could disappear into the world, and Jorge would never hear from him again. Jorge became increasingly frustrated and bitter over the years. However, the more hatred he felt, the more he dedicated himself to expanding his business. What began as a store selling agricultural supplies grew into a chain. As the chain grew too large, Jorge realized he would need a partner to help manage the wealth. The chosen one to assume the position of managing partner of the business was Gabriel, one of the best managers in the chain. 20 years younger than Jorge, Gabriel had a knack for negotiating better prices with suppliers and was also skilled with numbers. Jorge trusted Gabriel and allowed him to make many decisions on his own. Over their 10 years in partnership, Jorge came to see Gabriel as a son. Often, Jorge would take Gabriel to lunch or dinner at his home with Italo and Hilda. It was evident how much the man truly adored his partner. To Jorge, Gabriel was his son. Always friendly, Gabriel inadvertently conveyed to his biological son that he felt uncomfortable with the situation. However, Hilda always warned her nephew not to trust Gabriel. There was something suspicious about the way he looked at Jorge at times. Moreover, some stories he told at the table about how beloved he was in all the companies he worked for before meeting Jorge sounded false. Hilda believed that at the very least, this young man enjoyed lying. However, she suspected there was something worse behind Gabriel's intentions. At one of the dinners attended by Jorge's partner, Hilda dropped some hints upon realizing what was happening. Translate into English, Jorge humiliated her in front of Gabriel and Italo. He told his sister-in-law that while he was a man who sought to build his own wealth and life, she was nothing more than a parasite who took advantage of her sister's death to secure a lifelong position as caretaker of her nephew. She stood up to leave the dining room, but Jorge kept talking, saying she was as dry as a tree and would never have her own child. Everything Hilda desired or had was just leftovers from Fernanda. Especially bitter that night, Jorge shouted at his sister-in-law that he knew exactly what she was up to in his house, but she would never replace Fernanda. With a malicious smile, Jorge told Hilda that she would never come close to the beauty, elegance, and grace her older sister had. Hilda walked quickly out of the dining room. Once again, at a dinner, Italo learned a hidden truth about his family. He had never thought that his aunt could be in love with his father, but it made sense. He never judged his aunt, just reflected on how much she must silently suffer for loving such a cruel man who despised her despite her dedicating her life to him. Although he trusted Gabriel a lot, Jorge faced a delicate issue. Vanessa, the financial director of the chain of stores, requested a meeting with Jorge and told him she had found inconsistencies in Gabriel's reports. Jorge carefully analyzed, as finance was not his strong suit, and concluded that Vanessa was right. Something was very strange in that accounting. The question swirling in Jorge's mind was whether these errors were due to some incompetence on the partner's part or to a misappropriation scheme. If they were errors, of course Jorge would be frustrated to know that Gabriel was not as smart as he had always thought. However, if it was theft, it would be the second biggest disappointment of his life. The first was his wife's death. To get a concrete answer, Jorge decided to hire a specialized audit to analyze the company's accounts. Only Jorge and Vanessa knew about this audit, she who had brought doubts about Gabriel's work. However, one day Gabriel realized that his spreadsheets were being accessed by someone else. He immediately questioned Vanessa about it, and she played dumb. Very astute, Gabriel decided to thoroughly investigate what was happening behind his back. It didn't take long for him to discover that the new access came from an employee of that auditing company. Knowing that Jorge was conducting an audit was already worrying, but even more so that he was doing it in secret. Gabriel realized he needed to act quickly if he wanted to maintain his status as partner in that company. When promoted to partner, Gabriel entered only with his work, as he had no capital to invest. As he gained Jorge's trust, he increased his shareholding in the chain of stores to 30%. If his plan succeeded, he could increase that stake to 51%, definitively removing Jorge from the position of president. Gabriel noticed the turbulent relationship the company owner had with Italo, his son, since he started working there. It wasn't hard to make Jorge see him as the son he wished Italo could be. Gabriel had no problem playing with Jorge's feelings or being one of Italo's tormentors. All he wanted was to own that chain of stores himself, but with the ongoing audit, his plans wouldn't get far. Gabriel knew he could end up in jail. Jorge was more nervous than usual and took it out more and more on Italo and Hilda. The discussions between father and son were becoming increasingly serious. Italo had been deeply affected to learn that his aunt was in love with his father, and that was why she subjected herself to living like that. When the discussions got more serious, Jorge would shout at Italo that he was useless and couldn't let go of his father's pant leg. Even at 35, Italo couldn't gather the resources to leave with his aunt. His father always found a way to make him lose his jobs and made absurd demands. For Italo, it was a mystery why his father didn't just let him disappear. For Italo, his life seemed like that of a hamster running endlessly on a wheel inside a cage, with no prospect of ever being released. No matter how hard he tried to improve his life, he couldn't because he needed to accept the jobs that came up to afford his and his aunt's stay in his father's house. If they left Jorge's house, they would have nowhere to go. The money Italo earned from the jobs he got wasn't enough to rent even a small apartment. Besides, Hilda's medical treatments were becoming more costly, and she needed to continue seeing her doctor. To relieve all that tension, at least Italo had met a girl named Laura. She was the manager of the store where he had worked as a salesman for the last 4 months, until his father found a way to pressure the store owner to fire him. This time, Italo knew for certain that the dismissal was his father's doing, as Laura had told him. The young woman couldn't understand how a father could be so cruel to his own son. Italo tried to explain the inexplicable to his new friend. His father was punishing him for being, as he put it, the angel of death to his own mother. Laura repeatedly told Italo that it was absurd that his father would even think such a thing. Many women suffer complications during childbirth and unfortunately lose their lives. At the time Fernanda gave birth, this was an even more common issue, as there were fewer medical resources. Although Italo assured Laura that he also believed in that, it was evident that, in some way, he felt that he had been the angel of death to his own mother. In addition to dealing with his father, who renounced him, to worsen the situation, something was leaving Jorge even more irritable than usual. Even without knowing exactly what it was, Italo believed it had to do with work, because every time he returned from the company, the man was even more irritated. Sometimes Jorge would leave the dinner table hastily to take calls from someone named Fabricio from an auditing company. Italo wondered why his father wasn't getting help from Gabriel with this issue, as the partner was never mentioned. Regardless of what was troubling his father, Italo decided he was going to enjoy life a bit and then gathered the courage to invite Laura out on a date. The two used to go out for coffee and talk about life, but he wanted something different. So he made it clear to the girl that he wanted to go out with her with the intention of winning her over. Laura, who had secretly liked Italo for some time, was very happy and accepted the invitation. The two went to the movies. Italo believed his companion would choose a romantic movie to watch, but he was surprised when she said she wanted to see the new action movie that was showing. Italo loved action movies and didn't like romances as much, but he was willing to do Laura's will. He was even happier to discover that she also preferred explosions to strange scenes in balloons or bridges. While at the movies with Laura, Italo turned off his cell phone. After all, who would call him? When the movie ended, Italo and Laura walked hand in hand down the street when he decided to turn on his cell phone to check the time. However, as soon as the device turned on, Italo had a big surprise. There were more than 10 missed calls, some from his Aunt Hilda, others from his father's number, and others from an unknown number. Worried, Italo returned his aunt's call, who answered on the first tone with a tearful voice. Italo felt his heart racing in his chest. It seemed that all the air had disappeared and he couldn't breathe. Desperately, he asked his aunt what had happened, and almost unable to articulate the words, she said that Jorge had been in a serious car accident. The car lost its brakes and Jorge crashed at over 100 kilometers per hour into the wall of a house. The car was completely destroyed, and Jorge had been in surgery for several hours. Hilda was very nervous, as there had been no updates on Jorge's clinical status. Italo initially felt like he was without ground, but it was hard not to think that if his father did not survive the accident, he and his aunt would be the only heirs. The two would finally be free from Jorge's tyranny. Even if his father had maneuvered in the will to leave them without money, they would still be released. They would get something and could start their lives over. Jorge would finally stop making Italo lose his jobs and humiliating the woman who always loved him. While lost in those thoughts, Italo stopped listening to what Hilda was saying. It was Laura who brought him back to reality by asking what was going on. He then mechanically said that his father had been in a serious accident and was in the hospital. His aunt was on the phone explaining what was happening. Laura took charge of the situation and called a taxi so she and Italo could go to the hospital. When they finally arrived, they found Hilda with a petrified expression. It seemed that life had been withdrawn from her body, which now seemed only a tired shell. Hilda, with great effort, told her nephew and the girl with him that the doctor had just updated Jorge's clinical picture. He was in a coma, and there was no certainty whether he would wake up or not. All the medical team could do had been done, and now it was necessary to wait and see how the situation would evolve. The doctor had also said that soon a family member could enter to visit Jorge. Hilda told Italo that, of course, it would be him, but the young man immediately refused. He said he would give his turn to his aunt. Besides knowing that she needed to see him with her own eyes to know he was alive, Italo also felt that he couldn't do it. As soon as the doctor allowed the visit, Hilda watched her brother-in-law in what seemed like a peaceful and deep sleep. Despite knowing he was alive, she felt very confused and worried. How would Jorge's case evolve? Could he withstand the damage the accident did to his body for much longer? These were questions that would take time to answer. While Hilda was in Jorge's room, Gabriel arrived flustered at the hospital and saw Italo with a confused expression alongside Laura. Jorge's partner arrived asking if the worst had happened, that is, if Jorge had died as a result of the accident. Italo answered, after a few seconds, that no, but that his father was in a coma and doctors didn't know if he would wake up. Italo was so confused that he didn't notice anything, but Laura got the impression that Gabriel was somewhat disappointed to know that Jorge was still alive. On some occasions, Italo had talked to Laura about Gabriel, about the father-son relationship he had with Jorge. So it was strange for Laura that the man was so interested in his partner's death. However, as manager of a car dealership, Laura knew that sometimes in the corporate world, things were like that. At that moment, Laura decided she would watch Gabriel closely and wouldn't let him harm Italo. After all, if money was what mattered to Gabriel, Italo was an inconvenient heir. Hilda returned to the waiting room and saw Gabriel with a worried look. He quickly started asking how Jorge was, if Hilda believed he had any chance, if he was breathing with the help of machines. There were so many questions that Hilda began to feel dizzy, grabbing onto Italo's arm so she wouldn't fall. Realizing he was being, at the very least, intrusive, Gabriel changed his tone and said he was anxious because Jorge was like a father to him, and losing him would be terrible. In the days following the accident, Gabriel took control of the company and took charge of ending the audit work contracted by Jorge. Vanessa, the financial director, protested against this attitude and ended up being fired. The other directors understood the message. Gabriel wasn't playing around and would eliminate anyone who stood in his way. No one dared to contradict him anymore. Hilda visited Jorge daily hoping the doctors would finally tell her he had woken up, but it was always a disappointment. Months passed like this, and Italo continued to refuse to see his father. One day, Hilda told Italo that the doctors had informed them they would move Jorge to a room where family members could stay longer in his company comfortably. Hearing the voices of loved ones might help him wake up. Up until then, only family was allowed to visit him, meaning Hilda and Italo. However, in the new room, this rule could be relaxed, and even Gabriel, who was not a blood relative, could visit Jorge. Hilda tried to express to her nephew the concern this freedom raised for her. Hilda had always been a smart woman and had distrusted Gabriel for some time. Her suspicions about his intentions only grew after the accident. Gabriel seemed very anxious to hear that Jorge wouldn't survive the accident. When she openly spoke with Italo about her fear that Gabriel might harm his brother-in-law, Hilda heard from her nephew that he had been watching too many soap operas, that it didn't make sense. Later that day, Italo told Laura what his aunt had said, and he heard from his now-girlfriend that Hilda was right to distrust Gabriel. For a brief moment, Italo considered that maybe they were both right. But how could Gabriel have anything to do with the car accident or even attempt to harm Jorge in the hospital? These ideas were fantastical, and now Italo was focused on the new job he had landed at a sporting goods company. Since Jorge had stepped out of the picture, Italo's life had improved significantly. He had found a relatively good job and had also resumed his studies, pursuing information technology in the evenings. The busy routine of work and study was his excuse for not visiting his father in the hospital, but both he and his aunt knew that wasn't true. On Jorge's first day in a room that allowed more visitors, Gabriel went to the hospital. Hilda panicked when she learned her brother-in-law's partner was with him in the room and rushed there. When she opened the room's door, she saw Gabriel in a very suspicious attitude, manipulating Jorge's four. For a brief moment, she thought she saw him trying to inject something into the four. Gabriel was startled and, smiling, told Hilda he thought the four was loose and that's why he was checking it. Hilda knew that was a lie but pretended to believe it because she couldn't do anything without evidence. She decided to stay in the room until Gabriel left. Realizing the woman wouldn't leave, Gabriel finally decided to leave. That night, Hilda told Italo and Laura about the scene that had happened in the hospital. Laura agreed with Hilda, finding it very suspicious. Italo didn't want to admit it, but he began to think maybe his aunt was right. After Laura left, he stayed pondering over it, with many doubts swirling in his mind. If Gabriel was really trying to harm his father, would he feel sad about it? Italo had never cared about his father's money, all he wanted was enough to move out with his aunt and start anew somewhere else. That desire might be closer to realization now that his father wasn't pressuring anyone to fire him. The more he thought about it, the more he concluded he wished his father had died in that accident. Hilda passed by her nephew's room to wish him good night and tell him she would camp out in Jorge's room again the next day. Italo then told her that he had the day off work the next day and had decided to go visit his father, so his aunt didn't need to worry about that. She should take the opportunity to rest and not worsen her own health. Hilda said Jorge would be very happy to receive that visit, and Italo replied that he didn't think so. With a sad smile, Italo said the only phone call he had received from his father had been on the day of the accident, certainly from a hospital employee who thought he should inform the patient's son about what had happened. An odd expression came over Hilda's face. She then told her nephew that the hospital had contacted her through the house's landline. They found the number in a quick search on the internet based on Jorge's documents. It was Hilda who provided Italo's cell phone number for the hospital to contact him. Jorge's cell phone was destroyed in the impact of the accident, so it would be impossible for the device to have made any calls. Afraid of making her aunt more anxious with that story, Italo told her she must have imagined the calls due to the situation of that day. Hilda went to sleep. As soon as he was sure his aunt was asleep, Italo checked his voicemail and was surprised to find a message from his father from the day of the accident. After hesitating for a while out of fear of what he would hear, he clicked play. There was intense background noise, competing with the sound of the car. Jorge's voice said, "Italo, my son, my car was sabotaged, it has no brakes, and I don't know if I'm going to make it out of this. First, I need to tell you that I love you. Everything I did to hinder your life so far was just so you wouldn't leave. I had to tell you this. Be careful with Gabriel." The message ended with a terrible, loud noise that Italo understood as the moment of collision with the wall. Italo could barely breathe. In a short time, his aunt had informed him that Gabriel was in a strange situation in his father's room, and he had received a message from Jorge himself telling him he loved him and to be careful with his partner. It was all very strange, but what weighed most on his mind was the part where Jorge said he loved him and didn't want him gone. So why did his father treat him so badly? Why did he treat his Aunt Hilda so badly? Why did he force everyone in that house to live such a suffering and miserable life? After thinking it over, Italo decided he would talk to Jorge about it, even if his father couldn't hear him or never woke up from that coma. It was essential for Italo to say the things that were on his mind. The next day, Italo arrived at the hospital feeling nervous, and he wasn't surprised to see Gabriel also waiting for the start of visiting hours to see Jorge. Gabriel couldn't hide his disappointment at having to share the schedule with Italo. For a while, Jorge's partner imagined that Italo would stay for only about 15 minutes and then leave, but soon he realized the son would stay until the last minute. Unable to miss a meeting he had in half an hour, Gabriel left. As soon as he was alone with his father in the hospital room, Italo said he had received the message a few months late, it's true, but he had received it. He was still trying to process that information, his father's love for him and that strange way of showing it. Italo admitted that if he hadn't heard his own father's voice saying those words, he would doubt their truth. It was then that Italo said he had hoped his father would die in the accident. In fact, he had always imagined what life would be like simpler if one day he just crashed the car or his plane crashed. Feeling the full weight of what he had just said, Italo felt a tear roll down his face. At that moment, he took Jorge's hand and assured him that feeling changed when he heard his father say in that message that he loved him. Despite not wanting to admit it, Italo deeply desired and needed his father's love and acceptance. The young man believed those words said at the moment Jorge thought he wouldn't survive the accident could only be true, no one would be able to lie in such a situation. And in the end, Jorge chose his son among all people to leave what could be his last message. Very moved, Italo believed he felt his father's hand move pressing his own, but soon he pushed that idea out of his mind. It was probably just deeply moved by the discovery of his father's love and the risk Jorge was taking. Italo shared with his father that he didn't know exactly what to do, but maybe the first step would be to go to the police and show them that message. However, his father didn't have time to say in so many words that it was Gabriel who sabotaged his car and even how he knew that. The police might believe that was insufficient. Italo needed solid evidence of what Jorge's partner was trying to do. That's when he had an idea. It was risky, but it could work. When visiting hours ended, Italo went home and told Hilda everything that had happened. Very excited, his aunt didn't hide her happiness knowing that Italo was indeed loved by his father. However, she was very scared about the part related to Gabriel. What would they do? That's when Italo told her he already had a plan and that the next day they would get the proof they so desperately needed against Gabriel. Italo left home early to put his plan into action. When Gabriel arrived at the hospital, he realized that neither Italo nor Hilda had gone to visit Jorge that day. He knew that was his chance. Gabriel's initial plan was to inject a substance into Jorge's fore so that he would apparently die of natural causes. But after Hilda saw him manipulating the fore, it would be very risky to stick to that plan. Surely that which would make a scene to have the fore checked. The solution in Gabriel's mind could be much simpler. He carefully approached the bed. He first put on a pair of gloves and then positioned the pillow to try to suffocate Jorge to death. Italo was prepared for the moment. He had anticipated Gabriel's move. As Gabriel leaned over Jorge, intent on carrying out his sinister plan, Italo burst into the room with his phone recording everything discreetly in his pocket. "What do you think you're doing?" Italo shouted, startling Gabriel. Gabriel froze, caught in the act. He quickly straightened up and tried to compose himself. "I was just adjusting his pillow," he said with a nervous smile. But Italo wasn't buying it this time. He could see the malice in Gabriel's eyes, and he knew he had to act fast. Without hesitation, Italo showed Gabriel the recording he had just made. "I saw exactly what you were doing," Italo said firmly. "You were trying to harm my father." Gabriel's face turned pale, realizing he had been caught red-handed. He attempted to deny it again, but Italo was firm and resolute. He called for the nurses, showing them the recording and explaining what he had witnessed. The nurses immediately called for hospital security, who arrived promptly to detain Gabriel. Hilda arrived soon after, shocked and relieved to see that Italo had stopped Gabriel in time. She hugged Italo tightly, proud of his courage and quick thinking. Together, they informed the hospital staff about the message Jorge had left on Italo's voicemail. The police were called in, and they began their investigation into Gabriel's actions. In the following days, Jorge showed signs of improvement. He eventually woke up from his coma, and Italo was there by his side, grateful to have the chance to rebuild their relationship. Jorge was deeply moved when he learned what Italo had done to protect him. He apologized for his past behavior, explaining that he had acted out of fear of losing Italo and Hilda. Italo, in turn, forgave his father, understanding the complexity of their relationship. As for Gabriel, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder and sabotage. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the recording made by Italo. He was sentenced to a long prison term, ensuring that he could no longer harm anyone else. With Gabriel behind bars, Italo and Hilda were able to focus on rebuilding their lives. They moved into a new home together, far away from the memories of their past struggles. Jorge recovered steadily, grateful to have his family by his side. The experience brought them closer together, and they vowed to cherish their newfound unity. Years later, Italo completed his studies in information technology and found a fulfilling career. He often visited Jorge, their bond stronger than ever. Hilda, too, found peace and contentment, proud of her nephew and grateful for their second chance at happiness. And so, despite the hardships they had faced, Italo, Hilda, and Jorge found healing and hope, forging a future filled with love and resilience.